Hello everyone, today we talk about the First Crusade. You know that we already touched this topic in videos such as At the Origins of the Crusades, For a Perspective, Armed Pilgrimage and the Poor's Crusade. Also the evolution of Holy War from the Call of God to the regulated Crusade, 11th to 13th century. We still didn't make a history of the First Crusade proper. All these topics have been discussed in a sort of manualistic sense, and actually even today's video will be like this. Like, it won't be a proper history of the First Crusade, but still, around it in a kind of a more sequential telling, in the sense that we will follow the First Crusade properly, or what we call as the First Crusade, actually, because it was a it was a complex thing. Even it wasn't just an expedition, as we know. So, and if you have watched those videos, you know that there is always been this attempt from my side to define a little bit better both the context and the terminology of the Crusades in general, for that matter, and concentrating especially on this initial phase that is very important, because each crusade was very, very different. First of all, there were literally hundreds of crusades, historically speaking, even in this period that we conventionally, make start between, 1095, 96 to 1291. There were many crusades that we don't hear of, because essentially there were smaller expeditions that arrived autonomously, were also kind of politically detached from the mainstream. I mean, there is a great importance here to be given to context, as we were saying before, in realizing what our perspective towards the Crusades has been built like historiographically, which is not the only way of saying it's all wrong. We'd have to bust myths, etc. It's rather a way of saying, we already know a lot about this crusade, so let's expand on them, right? And obviously, the most updated historiography perfectly knows about these issues. As far as I know, I've been advised about it. The best author around is Ridley Smith. I've read even something from him. But in general, I'm not an expert on the Crusades as such. What I really care the most is really trying to acquaint other people. Not that I think that you need it specifically, because I know that you already know a lot, historically speaking, if you're here. Which is something that makes me proud, because even if they attract a crowd that already knows their own business in history, but rather, offering this series of perspectives that, even discussing the same topic, will represent themselves. Like, I could make videos like simply following, using Wikipedia as a base sketch and starting telling the actual story. And most YouTube videos are actually based on this linear, evidential approach, like saying, okay, let's start today to talk about the First Crusade, and seeing, from the beginning to the end, all the events. But I think that everybody can do that. Like, there is nothing easier than starting from events, from facts. That is very important as well. But I don't think you need a guide for that, nor you need a guide for what I will be telling you today. But this still can generate in those who instead do not care about these issues, or maybe that they're not acquainted, they're not familiar with them, making realize the importance of these crusades, wherever you want to define them. And we will get now a bit also on the terminological part of the story, and trying to frame these events in a kind of a healthier way, especially from an ideological point of view. Because it's sad to say, but objectively, whenever you talk about crusades, there is a lot of ideologism revolving around it. And the reason being, of course, that the crusades are, the broader definition you could give to them are kind of wars, right? I found, I wondered this because at one point also it was criticized because, for example, I said things like that Crusades were not wars of religion, which, as you know, given the videos I made, and this criticism didn't happen here, telling the truth, but elsewhere, like saying, exchanging, not knowing the difference between wars of religions and religious motives, which is very, very important in my opinion. You can't actually talk about the Crusades as wars of religion, as long as this doesn't become an excuse to say that essentially it was just a religious struggle. It was exclusively about religion, it was triggered by religion, and it was all about religion and nothing else. This is absolutely wrong by any historical standard. I don't think, historiographically speaking, there is any scholar that addresses the issues in these terms, nor there has ever been, frankly. And as we often said, that's why I don't like the term war of religion, because it kind of evokes, it's an emotional title, right? It's an emotional punchline. It's not an actual historical assessment. It's simply saying, reviving this idea of the clash of civilizations that exists behind religions and all what this entails. And for many, the Crusades were just fighting over a book, which was not the case either, because at that point it wasn't much of a matter of converting anyone, but if anything, to, as we will see today in part as well, but doing something else that had deep political motivations, whichever they were, because the political motivation is not, there is not politics as a thing on its own. Like, politics is literally about everything. So once I found kind of a curious definition of the Crusades, that if it's even like one of the most popular things, because I had googled them to see what the main results out there were, and see more or less how we try to kind of exercise this thing. And it was political wars. Like, yeah, okay, because these people have never read von Clausewitz, they don't know that wars are all political. Like, that if you talk about war, you don't need to specify there was a political reason behind it. As a matter of fact, I must add in that regard that you can add this coloring, like using the adjective religious, for example, as long as you separate that, like, it was a religious war, yes, because it had an important religious character, although it wasn't everything. It could be also economical, could be also, broadly meant under many points of view, that at that point had also few to do with religion by itself, right? And also, this wasn't just a clash between two sides. There were many sides from all of this. They also entered in conflict during the First Crusades. The Crusaders and the Byzantines kind of fought against each other at one point. At the beginning, there was an evolution in this. The Byzantines backed them as long as they could reconquer, for example, Nicaea, etc. At a point, they kind of left the Crusaders on their own, and there were also active attempts. So it's very, to counter them, telling the truth, the Crusaders surely wanted, if they had, to seize Constantinople. So you already understand in here that we're not even talking about the Muslims in this specific case. And yet, of course, the Muslims were there, and they were both enemies, but in case, even friends, depending on the occasion. And this is mostly evident from the kind of elementary history of the Ottoman states. Like, there wasn't a real, segmentation. Like, the background, was theoretically, we're here because we're Christians, and we're defending the Holy Land against the Muslims, etc., but real politics was something very, very different. The Christians were mostly against each other, just like the Muslims, and there were many intersections in the two sides. So this kind of apocalyptic dichotomic clashes between two cultures, between two religions, is a very narrow and mostly inaccurate depiction of what actually happened, for what we know is from a realistic historical point of view. And I feel sometimes also frustrated to be needing to repeat this at every video that I make about the Crusades, because I realize it's a hot topic, right? I don't care what other people really think about what I believe in terms of historical assessments. or better, I do in the measure, in which I consider, of course, criticism, but it seems that there are preconceived notions for whichever thing you say from one side can be misunderstood, and this happened to me relatively to these crusades, not here on YouTube but elsewhere when I share this stuff, that it was understood like one thing and the opposite of the other. And in part, I'm actually happy about that, because it proves that, first of all, I take different, I try to explain things from different perspectives. In part, it is true that there is a kind of general malevolence in twisting opinions, and therefore, whatever people want to presume that they have understood, okay, it's fine with them, but this has nothing to do with me. In part, because of course I don't want to simply say, I'm the pure victim here that has been aggressed by terrible people criticized, and I'm so angelic. No, I don't. Like, it's obvious that in my videos I say things that I can't forcefully balance in a cent-for-cent unbiased way. It's obvious that I must say this, my intention is really, I don't care. Like, I don't tell the history of the Crusades because I have favoritisms towards the Christians or towards the Muslims. And already this statement, for example, by many is interpreted like, therefore here you're just citing covertly from one side, because we all know that those were the good guys and the other were the bad guys, something like that. But even terminologically, and that's why I was talking about it before, everything you can't say, and especially in a 2 hours video, and multiple, of these same videos that I made, you can evenly find a single word, a single phrase, a single statement that you can profitably discuss. But I think that at least the regular followers at this point have understood that that they are debatable. I mean, but most of my followers, I think, by now have understood more or less how my videos work, and maybe have gotten used to them finally after 2 years. I think it's almost tomorrow. I think it's 2 years that I started in Schwerpunkt, and to the fact that I mean, even if I make a 2 hours long video, it sounds sometimes kind of messy and without a script or whatever, but it's like a big circle, right? Everything I say at one point of the video makes sense only if you consider it in the broader perspective, which I mean, doesn't require. I mean, it's not an enormous, great structural system that is so calibrated, but it's just that I make this effort of considering kind of multiple sides of the story, let's put it in this way, in order to define better what we are actually discussing. So today I thought to restart from a little bit from the first crusade proper, right, and understanding a bit what also from strictly military historical point of view. This is not a video about military history telling the truth. I mean, it happens to be talking about this campaign, the First Crusade, but and all warfare that escalated from it. But it's not precisely strictly speaking a military history video, but it does take into consideration also some let's say aspects that I care very much about. At least in the last months, my interest towards these things has increased thanks to Schwerpunkt in itself. I mean, the consideration that we have of the so-called Franks, like the Byzantines and the Muslims called the Western Europeans that came for the Crusades, and that were of course called Franks as well. I mean, they were called also in other names depending on which side they wanted to stress, whether it was classical ethnical classifications or more religious ritual ones, etc. So it all depends. There were many names that were calling each other, and observing in general how this idea of alleged barbarity of the West that sometimes you find around, that stems paradoxically from those same sources. I mean, it's obvious that or the Byzantines are talking about the Franks. They look at them like they were objectively backwards by certain standards. Of course, what does it backward mean in the 11th century? It's very debatable. In fact, this is already a word that maybe I should have not used. Like, I try to stress certain concepts, make more than that to make you understand something. If anything, this was an opinion that was referring to someone. So I don't think that the West was so backward. In certain cases, it is true. Like the Mediterranean was at this point still kind of on the lead, but I think we dramatically underestimate what already Western Europe had began to put in motion at this point. And this is something I say many times. And I think that the Barons or Princes Crusade, whatever you want to call it, the one that effectively creates the Ottoman states in the Near East during the First Crusade, it was actually a very good force. I mean, it definitely had problems of coordination, especially at the political level, but it was an expedition that objectively achieved an enormous success, right? The Byzantines were fighting on those frontiers for centuries, and yeah, of course, they were pressured by all sides, but this is the point. We're talking still about the end of the 11th century. It's a moment where resources are very, very costly. There is a lot of difficulty of mounting up expeditions in large armies in the first place. Here you have these guys coming mostly from France and in part of Germany and Italy that substantially seize some of the most important centers in the Near East just in one shot, right? It was tough. They bled and sweated a lot, and they even recurred to cannibalism. Yeah, it did happen apparently. It can be a rhetorical cliche, but we don't have to be that skeptical about it. But they achieved that. Right, and even this would open actually another chapter that is eventually how the Crusaders kept what they had conquered over the centuries, and we know that on the long run it was a failure. But I think it's important to stress that in the first place, the First Crusade proper was an astonishing success, and not just of that military expedition as such, but actually of the whole system that had put it in motion, starting from Western Europe. I mean, Frankish society. Think about the reforming papacy. Think about all factors without which even just the religious motive, for example, would have not been sufficient to make it achieve, right, and to happen in the first place. Because another thing about the religious issue. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. I think is that we perceive the religious side of the story as if, one day these guys woke up in the West and said, okay, now we became religious fanatics. We go conquering the Near East and butchering everybody, including Christians along the way, because this happened. It didn't obviously happen quite like that. It didn't every single, and we do this in the name of God. Like, you have to think that in the 11th century, I can't think of a single advanced civilization that wasn't fighting in the name of God, since whenever it existed, right? So to pretend that the Crusades were just a sort of regurgitation, I don't know how to say that, of fanatism, and that it was just spiritual, right? The spiritual side of the story was very important indeed, but it wasn't. It can't be the only aspect of the story. Even if there's been kind of coming back, because of course the Crusades have been interpreted like many things back in the 70s, in the 80s, in part. Essentially, or even before, essentially in socio-economical terms. This were Westerners who wanted the rich stuff. It was in the East, and they went there and they covered this with the excuse of religion. And rightfully we had a counter strike to this now that has started justly reevaluating the ideal side of the story, like the spiritual side, the religious side. That's why this is not just a matter of talking about religion in those times. It's really talking about religion today, relatively to these attritions that have existed, to the fact that, of course, people still have believed and disbelieved in religion and have been influenced accordingly, and this has produced different views that are not just historical, but they have something more added to it, and that's why it's healthy not to consider the Crusades, in my opinion, just as a religious business, right? Because that's aside being wrong, but if you basically get interested in the Crusade just because you think that those were either your guys and the other was the evil enemy, and vice versa, depending from which side. So you basically, I think, are just proving that you missed completely the context of a war that was already centered in religion in terms of military matters, like the idea of just war, etc. Of course, was boosted, was revived and transformed during the period of Crusades, immediately before in the West, but everybody was fighting for God at the time already, right? You don't need the Crusades for seeing that. It's just that you should be able, in fact, to take that as a standard at the time, and that's when you consider that as an important element, but also kind of an homogeneous one. You can start kind of observing multidimensionally what the importance of the Crusades as a whole were. And I can assure you that there's no scholar today that, and that will never be, that will have a comprehensive knowledge and understanding of the Crusades as a whole. Like, there is not a single expert that, first of all, has the competence or the capacity or the time or the intellectual skills to know everything about the Crusades by any standard. Secondly, nobody can answer such an enormous question for the same fact we don't know that much about the Crusades in the first place. Just the term crusade appears in the 13th century, just for you to know. These guys thought it in a kind of a different way. We don't know much about the Council of Clermont itself that had them started. We don't have many sources. This is a kind of a very archaic time. The production of sources is very, very limited. We don't have an historiography at the time that preserved facts and stories in a kind of a satisfactorily scientific way. Like we have struggled to understand even what's fictional, and deliberately, for literary reasons, for political reasons, whatever, not because they were trying to hide something necessarily, but just because maybe there was a context wherever the stories were written from that was influenced by a certain perspective. Of course, we should be, every historian should be able to read sources in their original language. If you don't know Latin, if you don't know certain vernacular Indo-European languages, if you don't know Arab, if you don't know, it starts, even Greek, of course, it starts becoming, and Greek obviously being an Indo-European language, but just saying, think about all the perspectives here. Strictly speaking, the Westerners, then the Byzantines, the Muslims, and which Muslims, by the way. So it's very complicated, and if we tell these stories just because we heard about it at one point, and or we decided to frame it that way, it doesn't really work, right? And this is valid, of course, for every single context, and the only medicine for this is actually studying and reading, learning, and having this broader, and deeper understanding of what this stuff was about. And telling the truth, we live in an age in which if you want to read something decent about it, you don't even have to spend a cent. So exploit this opportunity. See what this is about. Take a tour on academia.edu, for example. That it's not an encyclopedia, but it has definitely some interesting stuff. And about most recent research is that there is a lot of papers. You can consult sources, you can find references. So this is how you start really learning about this stuff, not listening stories that like I can tell you in these videos or documentaries or maybe YouTube is not highly recommendable in general, right? In order to learn things for real, you should make an effort, right? With your own mind. You can't just be passively listening to someone telling you about it and then pretending to have an actual understanding of it, because at that point your attention is mostly focused on whether agreeing or disagreeing with someone, the person you're listening to specifically, and not having a comprehensive knowledge of the actual historical problem, right? So it's somewhat difficult to even start talking about the Crusades in the first place. Like, how can we frame them, right? I like very much the term armed pilgrimage, which actually puts the accent on the military and religious aspect altogether. And armed is the adjective, and pilgrimages is substantive, and so that is quite important, because it's more like the importance is the concept of pilgrimage in itself. It's really the travel, right? It may seem strange, but this is a spiritual journey, if you want, that also escalated into warfare, right? And that by certain standards was always meant to be like that. In others not, right? Because crusaders weren't just knights, they weren't just fighters of some sort. There were a lot of civilians, women, children, old people, and the thing that we will never be able to understand, I presume, is really to feel what this collective feeling about the stuff was. Of course, it was very diversified according to who was, was involved into this, and for which reasons, and also on these individually there is an enormous literature, etc. But I think you can frame this whole picture into something comparable. Like, if you wonder how many people, for example, participated in the first crusade, well, we don't think there were actually that many. I mean, considering Europe, of course, was not dramatically populated compared to now, but I mean, with especially the expedition that came to, like, many people even never got it to the Holy Land, right? Others, like the expedition that conquered the various cities and established the Ottoman states, I mean, some people say they were like even 60,000. As you know, I think that probably there is nothing like more than 50,000 around when we consider especially armies, etc. Even if they were accompanied by other people. I mean, there is a logistical problem, and we have to imagine these armies actually being always surrounded by lots of people that also have nothing to do with the Crusades. To me, it's perfectly plausible that, aside from the emphasis that certain sources put on the fact that even there was a lot of, hatred and, even fanatism and etc., I don't know if there was a local Muslim merchant that made money by supplying the Crusader armies, do you think that those guys would have just butchered him and seized him if he could make the supplies arriving from other places? I mean, it's reasonable to think that it is not the case. We know, of course, during Crusader states, was full of Muslim mercenaries, as a matter of fact, as well. And I even made a video about that. And even if the first crusade objectively was kind of more genuinely and deeply spiritual and Christian, and in this sense also more kind of discriminatory and towards who was not just specifically a Christian, but also a particular type of Christian, right? The attitude was not very nice, but this, we know, I repeated this, we know a very, very few about what actually happened in there, right? So, of course, there were interesting stories, etc., and deeds sang, the jest and other stuff, but also these are somewhat, folky. They can be good pieces of literature, but we don't. They don't certify how the thing actually developed. And also, it's important to stress that there were several branches of several routes as well from which the Crusaders arrived. There were chunks that got lost along the way, some that got exterminated. At one point in Anatolia, the Turks actually they didn't manage to defeat the Franks at Dorylium, for example. There were certain detachments of Germans and Italians that were massacred, for example. So it's very complicated, and there were Muslims that actually agreed with letting the Crusaders pass, right? Also, one of the reasons why, strategically speaking, this was successful is that the smaller Muslim potentates, rather than saying, okay, I will, I resist to you and getting razed to the ground, they would simply supply the Christians. And this happened during the First Crusades. It was full of local Muslim lords that paid the Crusades for making them go away, right? And the Crusades were very happy with doing it and didn't touch much of of the stuff that this guy owned along the way. So, and this goes like, this doesn't mean that it's so logical. I mean, of course, it did happen at a certain point. There were senseless massacres. Think just about, I don't know, the one of Antioch itself, or the one of Jerusalem, right? That were, even Christians were slaughtered for the simple reason that they lived there, right? And they probably couldn't be distinguished as Christians, actually, by the Latins, as considering that these were Eastern Christians largely, and they also were different in other ways that now, for the perception of the time, we can't fully understand. Like, we don't know what the understanding was about this. Consider that Christians didn't even actually know properly what Muslims were, technically speaking. I mean, they had an idea that they were kind of enemies of the faith for some reason, but don't think that they actually understood much in the first place of what Islam was, or what the Christians still believed, largely in part, that these were kind of schismatic heretics, right? But things like this, right? And that was not even a big deal. Of course, there was someone who understood it, but still, in much later literature, during the low Middle Ages, you find these misunderstandings because, in part, it wasn't even a big deal in the sense that, as long as you fight or trade with these peoples, what do you care to understand further? If we think about what literacy was at the time, what education was at the time, on average, it wasn't. What was the need for a Christian to study? I don't know, Islam, the Quran. Basically zero. But we do know that, of course, those crusaders who stayed there had actually a much better understanding what the thing was, or at least they knew how to respect certain cults to like, for eminently political reasons. Like, you needed a true, like, there was a problem in the Ottoman states of all these bands of crusaders that arrived from the west, that the first thing they wanted to do when they landed was to kill some infidel, right? And the other crusades were there already that knew perfectly, maybe they had struggled so much for reaching a truce or making peace, etc. Try to calm them down, and to have a much more conciliatory attitude towards, and there was a lot of tolerance in the non-modern word sense of the word, actually, at the time, meaning that after the First Crusade, for example, as soon as Jerusalem was caught, theoretically all non-Christians were expelled, but after a while, Jews and Muslims, etc., were readmitted in. And you can't do this in a world that is largely, in fact, populated by these people who, produce, who trade, who sell, who have an importance you have to deal with in a way or in another, which can't be like, now I will massacre every single Muslim I find myself in front of me. The Crusades have never been like that, never, right? But there were, of course, single acts of fanatic and extreme violence against innocent people that were innocent even for those time standards. Like, in fact, they could be Christians easily, and the Crusades took, like, they scared people who found themselves along the way. We will see now that along the Balkans, for example, at one point the Hungarians fought against them, the Bulgarians. There was a resistance because this mob, especially the initial one that eventually got slaughtered by the Muslims, was actually a rabble of very dangerous and also fanatic individuals that created problems along the way of Christian countries that were living kind of their own way, and so this human avalanche coming, and without much of they couldn't do much to impose themselves, if not fighting against them. So here, as you understand, we have already kind of mitigated the myth of, this was just about religion and everything revolved essentially about the religious dichotomy. No, right? And in this sense, it's rightfully mostly a political matter, right? Including obviously the military aspect into the political one, which is so by actual definition. So by Clausewitzian definition, which means actual definition, basically. And so, first of all, as a background, let's think of Europe of the time being filled with itinerant preachers and religious agitators. Like, we know that we've made many videos about the Gregorian reforms, the pre-times of them, and we have observed, you can see that in the Medieval Christianity playlist, how the essentially Christianity had undergone a substantial crisis, right, for many reasons, and especially the revival of the empire in the West that had caused problems with the developing papacy and its ambitions, etc., and the problems of the control of the church and the appointments of the ecclesiastical titles and the monastic reforming waves, and also certain political, social, and economical instances that had brought to denounce, for example, the corruption of the church, but also the secular interference in it that in fact was the concept at the base of the Gregorian reform, right? It eventually didn't solve the problem of of corruption. It was a normal datum of every single political entity in the world, and still is, but rather had managed to create this merely ecclesiastical, like self-determined ecclesiastical center of power that from Rome had managed to exert an enormous influence on the local, not just ecclesiastical dynamics, but also on the political and social ones. But given that the church was extremely powerful, extremely it was widespread in terms of properties, of assets, of interests, etc., and so on. And the reforming, the church was technically into the struggle for investitures. Even the hardest wave had kind of the problem was still, the problems were hard and still there, and the church, however, had already reached a certain level of autonomy and self-determination from the emperor, right? Unlike in previous times, and there had been in fact conflicts, open warfare, and this had created naturally even a deeper problem of kind of justifying this in a Christian key of interpretation. And the rest of Europe wasn't faring excessively well in terms of Christian infighting. I mean, it was realized by even not just by Rome, but the local churches, and even by the secular authorities, that at least the highest one, that it was a big problem in managing violence in Europe, in the sense that the system was rigged by the usual dynamics that now were trying in fact to put an end to political fragmentation that was had been unbearable, had reached its peak in the 10th century, and kind of excluding part of for example, the male sons from the direct inheritance of land. So these people, normally being also military professionals by education, would spend their life essentially participating to the wars that afflicted the continent. Many of them had already been diverted, telling the truth, towards the Spanish, the Iberian Reconquista. It had succeeded. I mean, we have discussed in that video on the origin of the Crusades and how essentially even the recapture of Tarragona, for example, So I mean, there had been experiments about and already prodromes and I don't know how to say that, but the concept of the crusade was not so new. Like, it had to be defined properly, but it had already been used widely. I mean, this concept of going to heaven if you conquer a certain place, about the sacred nature of this world, it was becoming largely like not just defensive, but let's say preemptively offensive, in the sense that it was perceived now like a great struggle for not just for defending, but also for reconquering what had been lost, and especially those lands where Christians lived. Like, the whole deal of the crusade, objectively, especially with the Holy Land, is very evident in itself. It's because there are holy places there, right? So this is not just a matter of conquest proper, but it's the idea that fundamentally that Christianity should revive its control on what is legitimately their own sacred place, and also ensuring safety for every Christian who wants to travel in there. You don't have to think even about the borders between Christianity and Islam as just about military. I mean, like, were places where there was continuous ongoing warfare, and there were Christians just from one side, Muslims from another, looking at them like it wasn't like that. There were plenty of Christians who traveled in Islamic land. There was plenty of pilgrims. And do you think that pilgrims were actually stopped going to the Holy Land? They wouldn't, right? The pilgrimage was a world business. The Jerusalem is a sacred city for three monotheistic religions, that are theoretically also part of the same stock. So, why closing the flux of pilgrims that actually make you cash a lot of money, etc. So aside from the most zealous attitude that also were proper, for example, the Seljuk Turks, as the newcomers are always very eager to prove that their own fate, etc., even with violence, etc. But even that had kind of started vanishing. The same Seljuk expansion, now we'll see it by the 90s, the second half of the 90s, had already declined. It was evident that the Seljuks had lost momentum. There was a connection with the Byzantines that remained very strongly since the time of Manzikert, but pilgrims were there. Bands of Western contractors were scattered all over the Mediterranean and Near East. They were also employed by the Muslims, telling the truth. There were Christian guards of caliphs, as much as even Muslim guards of emperors eventually, and this is fascinating. Even Constantinople was open to Muslim traders, to people. I mean, it was normal, absolutely normal, and much more varied than what it sounds. And this idea of reconquering what had pertained one day to the empire, to the Christian empire, never forget about this, it was not new, right? It was the same principle that Rome had always had. Theoretically, Rome was destined to conquer the whole world, and the land that it had lost belonged to it. It was kind of a increased value in it, in the sense that it had even already belonged to the Roman armies that had ruled in there. But really, what makes the most important leap forward in here is the papal perspective of considering Western Christianity now as a whole ensemble, right? Even theoretically, this was an ecumenic perspective. So theoretically, all the various churches and everybody had to be part of the church, and at the end of this, it was the papacy in this new monarchic ideal that the Gregorian reforms have brought forward. And there was much more than that also, because it wasn't much a problem of affirming papal authority, for example, on the Muslims. Do you think the Pope actually cared anything about Muslims living in places like Egypt or Palestine? Or do you think he was more concerned actually about German emperors coming to Rome and dictating them what to do, with violence, with armies as well on their own? The struggle for investors was in fact, the investiture controversy was exactly about this, and the papacy in this moment of trouble for the same empire that, as you know, was pretty much, unstable at this time, had expanded in this field that was enormously promising, right? And which was the one of acquiring essentially a secular authority, or better, legitimizing secular authority in the name of the papacy that was essentially saying, that secular authorities have to do all what the papacy says. So it's basically the same way for saying that the Pope really wanted to control the Christendom as an emperor, or through an emperor, let's say better. And the First Crusade is actually the most astonishing success of the reforming papacy, by all standards. Like, the Second Crusade would already be something very different, and that's where the kings actually will participate for the first time. In First Crusade, it was no king, it was all noblemen of other type that at that point were joining the call, also because they hoped in this way to gain kind of a greater autonomy in their own respective political contexts from the emperor, from the kings, right? And thanks to papal backing, to papal support, right? So there was an enormous amount of interests at stake in here, and the papacy did something that objectively nobody had ever conceived in that form. Like, when the Byzantines asked for help, they didn't think of like a campaign launched by the papacy without even the support, like the cooperation of the Western Emperor, that aside from the natural enmity with the Eastern one, had, however, kind of cooperated in certain contexts. And in the previous centuries, we have talked about this also in the other videos, there had been, and this is radically overlooked, crusades, fundamentally. I mean, there had been at least experimentations of an effort, concerted political and military activity to dislodge the Muslims from places like southern Italy and Spain, for example. And these were succeeding. I mean, the First Crusade started in 40 years, 50 years almost later, that the Normans, as vassals of the Pope, had started to conquer Sicily, for example. It was Muslim. The Italian navies had cleared the Western Mediterranean, Sardinia, the Balearic Islands from Muslim piracy. Of course, it was still there in part, but there's no comparison. Here, as we often say, at many levels, even in terms of trade balance, the Western Europeans are taking the upper hand, right? And the Iberian Caliphate had disgregated by this time, and therefore the Christians passed on the offensive. So there was room for expansion. It was a great momentum was being gained. Like, and even the Seljuk Turks, as we've said before, were substantially, like nominally, stretching from the almost the Aegean in Anatolia to further to Persia, etc., but just namely, right? They were fragmenting politically speaking, and even if theoretically was a common coordination de facto, they were kind of all scattered. And Crusades proved this, because they didn't meet much of a concerted resistance at that point. So the Crusades, in this sense, the First Crusade especially, was exploiting an incredibly propitious moment for that is also difficult not to catch the rationale of, honestly. Like, because we tend, when we stress the spiritual perspectives, that are okay to me from a cultural point of view, but when you think at this broader phenomenon, of course, you don't have to think of a grand strategy like the papacy planning this reconquest, and they didn't essentially even know when they left what they had wanted to do. Like, the fact that Jerusalem, for example, would have had to be reconquered was fundamentally not known. Like, this were things that were decided along the way, when the Crusaders assembled at Constantinople, then eventually along the terrible way that they had to cross Anatolia and then into Syria and Palestine. I mean, it all came like randomly by a certain standard. But it's difficult not to see the intentionality behind this. It's not saying this was just a sense of a religious inspiration. It really was not. It was calculated. It was actually a great effort to bring the Mediterranean back again. There had been a schism here. Like the Christian, like the Church of Rome didn't recognize the one of the imperial authority anymore at that level. This also actually happened on another level, but I mean this is strictly political. But the two churches were already separated. The effort here to hopefully even take Constantinople, as would happen actually 1 century afterwards, and Catholicize, let's say, the Eastern Christians, was a real goal that the papacy wanted to expect. Right, the papacy had an enormous. We often conceive the papacy at this point like mostly a Western thing. We think that Rome was always in great contact with Constantinople, with the Eastern world in general. They were extremely careful about every move, and in fact, there was a great ambiguity behind this. Like the papacy at this time was reviving, for example, the concept of the Eastern and Western Roman Empire, because they wished in this way to recognize themselves as above both the Germanic and the Byzantine Emperor, and they were creating something that is in fact kind of difficult to reconstruct even ideologically. We don't know what in these councils actually was claimed. We don't know what at Clermont really happened, right? We have stories of people that wrote after 1100 when Jerusalem had already been taken. So it's all very, and when the Crusade at that point had, you have to think probably not many actually believed even in the feasibility of what would happen, because the campaign itself was kind of crazy if you think about it strategically speaking. I mean, this was an astonishing success. So the Church of Rome had scattered all these, propaganda spreaders, we can say, the Patarians as well. I made a video about the Pataria actually, and you can go look at that as in fact as a prodrome of the Gregorian reforms proper, that that also were spread among the masses, right? The inferior classes, and especially the one of the cities, right? And that had been involved into the struggle against the simoniac and concubinary clergy at that point. So there was also a verbal dimension, like a vocal actually, an oral dimension, that we miss completely. Like we know what the kind of the political propaganda was in medieval Europe, mostly about written stuff, but there was an enormous importance covered by the oral transmission. We don't know how these things worked, but in those times where very few people could read, much of this was also about spreading ideas and claiming, and you can imagine what the sense was in here. The idea that also the West was inflamed because the Pope was fighting wars against the Emperor, right? This is not good. Like we constantly underestimate what the trauma in the mindset of a person of the 11th century about this could really be from a Christian point of view. The emperor and the papacy are not supposed, the empire and papacy are not supposed to fight. They should be supposed to work together for the well-being of Christendom. This wasn't happening. So this apocalyptic view of the situation, this great hope for radical reforms and changes, and had inflamed the masses. And it was a strong spiritual push that can't be denied at this point, that helped support and putting together these expeditions, right? And the victory of the reformers had also opened to a moment of stabilization, and this had all these agitators had created problems now for the Pope, in the sense that Rome didn't know at this point even how to get rid of them, because these were fundamentally radicals, especially the ones that were criticizing the elites for their wealth, etc., and not the church as such, not the Roman institution as such. On the contrary, there was an enormous trust at the time towards the figure of the Pope. Like the criticism would arrive in much later times, in the sense that nobody actually, like, also we like to look at this sometimes as heretics, as free thinkers, etc. They weren't free thinkers at all. These people were serious religious fanatics that took, however, the excuse, in fact, religion for doing things like stealing, like killing, and taking power, etc. And this was that. It was an enormous problem. That's why, from the 12th century onwards, the church has to put in motion to repress these movements, because there was a moment in which the Christendom really risked to be taken over by these groups. And today we think of them, the poor free-thinking guys that were slaughtered by the terrible obscurantist church. No, it wasn't like that. It was like a revolution. It's as if now terrorists start taking over. It was an enormous deal. It is what actually brought the secular and ecclesiastical elites together to say, okay, we have to get rid of these people. Because this wasn't even just religious, as we say at the time. This was largely social. It was a social problem. It was something deriving from the objective repressions and oppressions, let's say, of the elites, of the increasing affirmation of the feudal authority, the idea of the progressive loss of freedom of certain communities that had up to this point historically lived kind of with large degrees of autonomy, now that were being framed into these larger systems like feudal monarchies and even the ecclesiastical elite. So it was a very common, very tormented and divided world, right? There were bitter struggles, there were violent, and all these were backed by an enormous material strength. Europe was expanding fast. They were getting more precious metals. They knew how to pay, how to hire troops, how to invest money. And the Crusade was largely also about this, about levying enough resources to send troops from a place that doesn't, frankly, here, the first Crusade wasn't launched by a kingdom, for example. Here it was essentially a spontaneous movement, or at least the church essentially guided it, but it was spontaneous. You can't identify one group, one day, I don't know how to say it in English, someone committed this, right? There is an instigator, like or maybe instigator, yes, but instigator also sounds like a criminal thing, but I mean someone who sent this, like an official authority. The papacy did it from a spiritual point of view, but technically speaking, these guys set themselves in motion on their own, right? But these agitators also had to be sent away. Like there was a problem of getting rid of them, as much as of these young cadets which spent their life into the most violent and disruptive ways to vent their impetus somewhere else, right? So, and these agitators, having become a problem, also were dissatisfied themselves by the outcome of the ecclesiastical reform, right? They hadn't got what they wished, like the church of the poor and of the equal, right? There are strongly communistic ideals behind this. That's how they saw the church of the origins. In that sense, there was a radical monastic side of the story that also was quite important also in Hermetism, in this complex and tough experiences, also of spiritual even physical deprivation. This words that from our perspective seem to be detached from reality at the time, being really a way to cope with a world that didn't give much of an opportunity to find different views of the world. Probably the mentality of these people in the 11th century, even if we can't obviously understand it, but was much more excitable and simple in the sense, but of more open, right? Capable of believing and trusting and really hoping for the right solution to take over at a totalizing level. Like it's maybe just a speculation, but it's obvious that we're different types of mentalities, and that many were oriented also much more materially speaking, and the mercantile side of the story, I think it's also very overlooked when thinking of the Crusades, because we concentrate mostly on the Crusaders and their states in themselves, but not of also who had the main interests passing from the routes that these Crusaders actually held, right? So you can't deny the presence of a broader economical interest as well to control certain areas, certain markets, and fundamentally gaining also through them a greater power on other markets. These were the moments in which, for example, the Venetians were getting great concessions by the Byzantines and controlling their markets and needing more, right? And needing other, and already having actually contacts since centuries with the same Islamic lands whose markets they knew, right? Never forget about this, that Europe was starting and even the secular, the elites were starting to care a lot about the benefits that could derive from the opening of these routes. It wasn't just about, a disconnected society in which just the maritime republics believed in something and the feudal elite believed something else. I mean, there were deep interests in common in this sense. What we lack here, from a strictly historical perspective, because we don't have the sources, is in fact the evidence of this. But we do know that this war was very interconnected. We know that these problems were realistically there, right? So it's obvious that sources are obviously much more inclined to tell the story of the Crusade in the perfect Christian perspective of the story, like saying it was all about the will of God and whatever, but there was indeed much more than that. So the expedition in the east was very, very useful in this context to answer a great amount of questions. Like, it was presented as the coming back to the house of Father, the conquest of the heavenly Jerusalem, right? As we've seen before, we don't actually know whether Jerusalem was the actual destination of the Crusade since the beginning. We lack evidence of it, but we surely know, though, that was the ultimate goal. Like, even take maps of the time. You look where Jerusalem being at the center of the world, right, and having an enormous importance. Like, pilgrimage was something like, even for even this was a business. Like, it wasn't a business just for people who stayed in Jerusalem to take those tolls. It was really a business also for the people who brought people to Jerusalem or who left Europe for Jerusalem, and that did that habitually, right? And that consumed, that invested money. Like, they needed to be shipped there, they needed to be defended there. There were contractors all the way that would bring you to the Holy Land, right, at your expenses, in a world that was dangerous. So, and we know that there was a lot of traffic attached to it. So Jerusalem was definitely not just a symbol, right? It was a concrete interest for bringing this Near Eastern city under the control of the Western world in some way, and therefore surrounding in part and kind of being a player in the center of a chessboard that were up to that point like the Westerners had not been represented, but they had played in there. They had like observed in there with all the mercenaries that were employed by the Byzantines, eventually also by the Seljuks, that were all Frankish origin, um, in certain contexts, right? So they knew a lot. This is what we tend to forget all the time, thinking especially at the Western world, enclosed in itself, without contacts with the outside, that didn't travel, that didn't know. They knew everything. They knew everything. They knew everything about what was important to know for them. And this was definitely one aspect of it. So the beginning of the crusade actually was very spontaneous at the same time, because this proves that it wasn't just about the papacy pushing for it, but really existing certain religious, spiritual ferments out there that push people to need, to find a new answer, to undergo this experience that was considered as the noblest and the purest, and this mystery of the Orient that contained the holiest places, the promise, the representation of the same paradise in ideal, and the promise of salvation in itself. So this was, even if the Western Christendom wasn't particularly aware of the same religious finesse, like you could observe and hear how it would be interesting to have studied in many ways the participants to the crusade, and observe how many of them actually, if they have even read the Bible, or if they how they knew the Bible as such, because obviously most of them wouldn't even know how to read, but what was their ideal, what was the promise that existed behind it, because for many of them, we do know it, there was a genuine belief in the salvation for who would undertake this enterprise, right? It was not just anecdotal. It was also a very contractual view of the world. Like this, this attitude towards salvation reveals actually many hints of, still coexistence of pagan minds and magical beliefs. I mean, this was a world that had emerged actually from paganism from a very recent time. Actually, there probably still were traces of paganism among, if anything, in the mindset, right? The would be interesting to observe. We surely talk about this in a dedicated video. So it was at the beginning this world movement. So ranks of kind of the people had to lose less, telling the truth, and this still observes highlights the rationale of the role in parallel with this deeper conscientious spiritual religious problem, right? These were poor pilgrims that also were armed, like they were already partially defenseless. Never think of the masses as actually, the poor, like just nice people just ask for a piece of bread, and no, that they knew how to. I mean, they lived in conditions that probably didn't make them think that they could lose more than that. So they saw this opportunity as a form of redemption, as a form of future, like even as an asset. Like life was definitely difficult at the time. There wasn't much of a guarantee of surviving, especially in certain conditions, in certain social conditions. So dining in this enterprise and dining in another way, well, wasn't probably very, very different after all. And these groups were undisciplined. I mean, they were just they just started to leave very tumultuously towards the east, and along the road they committed some of the worst atrocities and crimes, common crimes, telling the truth, and killing even people, especially the Jewish communities along the valleys of the Rhine, the Danube, that they were crossing, right? Not just the Jews, and this is interesting. So they were just common, like, kind of brigands in part, but the Jewish communities were targeted as, still non-believers, as infidels, as someone who didn't participate, obviously, to the same kind of exaltation, and because not because they didn't participate even to the political life as such. It was dominated by the Christian elites, and who also were kind of rich usually, because they were, not actually, the Jewry as such was not particularly wealthier, but these were people who were involved into trade, because they were relegated even to usury and to other activities that were forbidden to the Christians, and that the Christians actually carried out anyway. But the Jew was already at the time considered, like, especially in certain areas of Europe, like an outsider, someone that because actually the history of the Jews is very complex, and the origins of especially in the Middle Ages, of antisemitism are deeply overlooked. But in fact, the first crusade is considered as sadly and tragically as the beginning actually of these first mass exterminations, right? I made a video actually on medieval Jewry that deals with this. It's not that before there were actually Jews were always discriminated against in the Christian world, since the establishment of, but especially from late antique period. But objectively, during the First Crusade, and from their moment onwards, especially the aggressions towards Jewish communities and massacres and slaughters increased rapidly. This probably had to do not just with the crusade in itself. I mean, obviously these episodes are most eventually triggered by the fact that wherever these guys passed, the Jews were killed. But there was probably also a greater tension that that same fanaticism for Reformation had brought also to observe this non-Christians as kind of potential plotters and enemies, and this suspicion and hatred, and it was largely, as always, actually, we know it from many studies, even from better documented times, that it was just for stealing their property, right? Very, very banally. In fact, especially the richer ones were targeted. The rest of people cared less, right? So it was sometimes just an excuse. Telling the truth, the ecclesiastical authorities also protected the Jews in this point. It's famous, very famous, the Archbishop of Cologne, if I'm not wrong, that offered shelter in his property to the Jews, because this bands were aggressing them, were creating. This was a great problem, right? It was a problem because it was a problem public order fundamentally. These guys arrived en masse from other lands. They stole, they destroyed, they killed these people, and they disrupted the whole economy, right? And naturally, Jewish communities were important. At the point they also were, of course, integrated in of course, for the limits of Christian regulations, but they were functional to local economy, to the local wealth, especially in Central Europe, in Eastern Europe. I mean, the Jewish communities were of dramatic importance for urban development and trade. So this is kind of the ugly side of the story, of course, that that is not surprisingly so, in the sense that humans tend to do pretty messed up things in certain conditions, especially when there is no particular control, right? This is also what favored, I would say, the Crusades, the first Crusade in particular, as such. I mean, the fact that there wasn't much of a way to stem these movements, to control them overall, that Europe was so politically fragmented that at this time emperors, like the emperor was excommunicated, other kings were kind of fighting against each other. The Crusades were the first Crusade was started with the major political authorities, secular authorities, busy in something else, right? And therefore, who could even control? And kingdoms were strongly decentralized. There was no real territorial control up to a certain point, and concentrated masses of desperate people like these ones could objectively cause a great problem, right? An enormous problem. Like, would concentrated, if everything is fragmented, you don't find a solid compact mass to stop you. Chances are that people probably will also let you do something along the way in terms of damage, as long as you pass by and you go somewhere else, right? This is what paradoxically, even on a larger strategic scale, would do the Muslims with the Prince's expedition in the Near East. Nobody was interested in absorbing individually the impact of this group that would, however, go away at least in some point. So, among the various prophets that guided these bands of pilgrims, there were certain figures that passed to history. Let's say, in more famously, for example, Peter the Hermit, Peter of Amiens. There were other leaders telling the truth. Some of them were just spiritual, like him. There were also knights, for example, famous Walter Saint-Savoy. There was kind of a symbol of this kind of cadets and that were without inheritance and had decided to start this. Peter the Hermit can't even be framed precisely in the ecclesiastical picture. Like, we don't know technically who he was, but it was full of people like him. He was a man gifted with great charisma and kind of attraction for capabilities for bringing people together, for getting followers. Right, today we know how paradoxically through social networks that brought up this new revived this idea of the following, of the idea that you're kind of free of following certain paths without being constrained. We do know that there is mass. There are mass dynamics that are sometimes we say, oh, look at how many people follow that person that is kind of an idiot, like, or not. I'm not saying that Peter the Hermit was an idiot as such, but that doesn't seem to have, even politically speaking, people were demagogues and other men, like it was plenty of them that had the capability of just attracting followers, attracting consensus, and we know they work, and these are in fact some of the cleverest people around in some ways, because they're not doing them for kind of necessarily spontaneous reasons, but they have deep the realization, understanding, and let's say feeling and sense of how what this whole thing should be about, right? At least on some occasion. Of course, we know relatively few about Peter and the demagogues like him. The major problem was that it was relatively easy to attract, to gather people, but the problem was to guide them in an orderly fashion. These movements were, first of all, many, right? There were bigger groups that naturally attracted gravitationally others, also for the reason that we explained before, that is, the more they were, the more they could gain, right? But it was unvirtuous system, since of course the more they were, also the more they would the greater problems they would have in terms of actual control and of even availability of resources. So it was rather the knights of the time that searching for adventure by default in their lifestyle, and surely also excited by a sort of raw religious enthusiasm that began to frame these crowds. Like this is important. This is often overlooked. Like the milites, the knights, already had this understanding of command, right? Of command, of organization, of logistics. They were. We named him before Walter sans savoir, that became effectively the secular guide, together with Peter the Hermit, of this first expedition, and that began like to to stick together in the same way. Like the more knights they were, the more naturally they became imposant as a political and military force. They could gain more, and they were supported by these crowds, among which there were also kind of strong young men that were armed and were working not very differently actually from, I don't know, their squires or other support. Like the 11th century, always remember, it's cavalry hasn't gained that upper hand like yet, like it would do in the 12th and especially the 13th century, right? The infantry mobs, this concentration of foot soldiers, sometimes was really really dangerous for the same knights. Like cavalry, even the time in which it actually dominated the battlefield, knew perfectly well what a couple of of angry peasants that would catch an isolated knight out there in the open could do, right? And it happened very very frequently, very often. There were areas of Europe in which feudalism proper hadn't quite spread. Most of these crusaders, now we will see it, came from this area of frontier between the Romance and Germanic languages in Central Europe, like in the borders with Germany or into Germany, that were still largely savage lands, where infantry actually was, even because of the terrain of swamps and forests, was very very important still. And even the local knights were used to fight dismounted more frequently, apparently. So there is this there's the youth as well. The idea that knighthood, after all, is in the 11th century still reachable by even a common peasant, right? If he knew how, if he stole a sword and knew how to go on horseback, he could maybe become part of a retinue and make fortune and becoming a knight properly, right? So there is this demographic strength as well in the picture of especially of Central Europe. This point is, let's say, expanding fast, and also is not well off enough to remain particularly rooted to the local basis, so that they feel the need to push to expand. In the other day just we were making a video about the Germanic expansion towards the east, for this, in fact, even demographic and economic reasons, right? And in spite of this knightly, first of all, the knights there was plenty of errant knights, right? For the same reason why even the Crusades had success in this spontaneous move, because there wasn't much anyone who could stop knights, bands of knights roaming around. Like these guys could really, there are not tanks around, there are not missile launchers around, there are not machine guns around. You can't stop a knight unless you have other knights, right? You can have, as we were saying before, kind of lots of angry peasants with spears and stuff like that, but you need a lot of them, right? And most of the time, the knight will kick their back, let's say, and they this is a reality in the advent of the adventure. The idea of discovering new opportunities of making their fortune through the craft of arms, right? So knights would naturally appear at the head of these crowds, and yet the Crusades of the Poor, however, failed, as many as they were, basically in failures for each one of them, like in the sense that only a very few and scanty groups of survivors of these expeditions were met in 1096 by the chiefs of the great, instead feudal expeditions that and that came to follow them at that point, right? The others died, right, more or less tragically along the road, right? They were literally killed by the local communities that didn't want them to spread, to arrive, to steal, to commit violence. They would be killed by other noblemen, of course, that maybe were called to put an end to this disorder and these massacres that they carried out. And it was a very long road, right? The first crusade followed essentially the land routes, right? Were terrible. Like, think of what it meant to travel across Europe from, I don't know, from Belgium to Constantinople, passing through the Rhine and the Danube. Like, think of all the people, like the Danubian areas, the Balkans, are not very, hospitable. Like, there are peoples who, have been thinking about the Hungarians that have been settled down just from the last century fundamentally, and there are also still kind of semi-nomadic groups around, or people believed still very also militarized costumes, and that are not very happy if you come to annoy them, and therefore, like, historically speaking, in fact, many even knights were butchered along the road by these ferocious, I don't know, Bulgarians, or they were, angry and tough, and they were as hungry as these pilgrims, let's say, and therefore it was either them or the others, and it was a very tough very tough journey, right? Naturally, we don't know much about these movements proper. Like, we can't just guess that, and we can't see how much interest even these movements brought. Like, even presumably attacking their caravans, attacking their camps would be profitable. These pilgrims, as poor as they were, they sometimes left with all of their property, right? This was, very, you can imagine all the people could take advantage of it through sheer force. So, as we were saying before, instead, the truly successful expedition was the one of the barons, or the princes, as you want to call them, and of their own vassals that, in this case of the princes and their own vassals, let's say better overall, comprehensively, among which traveled, as we have seen, also kind of harmless pilgrims that met in 1096 at Constantinople. And the spiritual chief of this expedition was the papal legate Adhemar of Monteil, that was Bishop of Le Puy. Furthermore, there were many groups, mostly French-speaking ones of knights. So there were the Provençals, guided by Raymond de Saint-Gilles, Count of Toulouse, that was one of, actually, of the major powers of the time. Like the county of Toulouse at this point was in southern France, southwestern France, had within the Western Frankish monarchy a great, but it was fundamentally autonomous from the northern Carpathians, and they were wealthy, they were rich, and they were on the Mediterranean. So actually, you see here also the potential interest towards this. In the 12th century, the county of Toulouse would be, as you know, destroyed in parts essentially by the Albigensian Crusade, and this allowed that essentially to the French of the north of seizing control, especially in the 13th century, of the access to Mediterranean, and there were other nobles, like for example the Marquis of Provence, always in southern France. Then there were the German Brabant sons of Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, that would also become king of. Actually, he was kind of a more. He refused to be appointed king in Jerusalem, because he said, I can't wear a crown, like of gold. I don't remember the quote, but where my lord has worn a crown of thorns, right? Then there were the Flemish of Robert Count of Flanders, the French of Hague of Vermandois and of Stephen of Blois, the Normans of the Duke Robert of Normandy, that was the son of William the Conqueror himself. Then there were the Siculo-Normans or Italo-Normans of Bohemond, son of Robert the Guiscard, right? Bohemond of Taranto, this was, as you know, the Siculo-Normans were probably among all of these names, the ones that were more projected towards the Mediterranean, that would also attempt to conquer the Byzantine Empire, to seize Constantinople. They captured Thessalonica, they raided into Thessaly, into Epirus, etc. So they had already done it in Epirus, telling the truth. So you see here mostly a French-German and in this case southern Italian element, right? And some of them will have, especially like the Siculo-Normans, deep interests in building kind of a Mediterranean dominion, right? The others were kind of more continental powers, like not even the Count of Toulouse technically was a Mediterranean power as such. I mean, geographically, yes, but it wasn't much of a maritime force by itself at the time. And you see essentially what, the inherent. First of all, this is a Frankish area, right? This is, aside from the English that here do not figure, but this is all what. Aside from the England, basically, and central and northern Italy, maybe a part of northern Spain, these are typically Francicized areas of the continent. The ones who would produce feudalism at its best, right? So it's very meaningful to find them here, not as a side, but power, but as the cream of European nobility, right? And the idea, the aims of this great expedition were not clear. The object of the expedition was not clear when all these troops reached Constantinople. The Byzantines were freaking out in the meanwhile. Like, technically they were all smiling and saying, finally you came, but they didn't expect that. Like, as we have seen before, the Byzantines thought that the papacy would send kind of more Western mercenaries, like it had already going on in the past century. They didn't expect an entire army arriving and gathering around in front of the gates of Constantinople, and these guys were were difficult to cope with. Like the Byzantines were freaking out because they realized that these were fight warriors, and pretty damn good ones. These were some of the finest cavalrymen of the West. Like the Byzantines, just like the Muslims, and we made some videos about this, recognized without any hesitation the fact that the Franks were the best knights in the world. Like they became, like, this is interesting because they considered by themselves just like that, but the courage, the fanatism, like fanatism is important in warfare as well. You need to be determined, you need to make, for whichever reason that motivates you so strongly, that determined of making action following thought, right, and risking your life. And these guys were fanatically proud and unruly, though. They were also quite, they didn't like each other very much, like nor the Franks with the Byzantines, but not even the Franks among each other, right? So the Byzantines were clever to treat them well, and to, of course, there were quarrels continuously, but let's say they were seconding them because they knew, first of all, they could use them, they could vehiculate them in a way that could be profitable for them, right, as it would happen, and up to the point it was convenient to them. And the Franks didn't like the Byzantines. They thought they were all kind of too pretentious about the fact it was this emperor. Who is the emperor? Like those Westerners were, even though technically there was an emperor in the West, like the nobility thought they were kind of all alike, and that even the greatest power authority had to share a bit of it with the others, because what kind of greedy bastard would have he been otherwise? So there were evident cultural differences, and they were the enemies of as we've seen it. Bohemond of Taranto was, these were open enemies to the empire. They had invaded it the last decade, so it was not easy, right? It was getting hot there. And in fact, the Byzantines tried to push these guys away as much as they as soon as they could, right? And the idea of arriving up to the Holy Land and to conquer Jerusalem, probably developed along the way. Like surely also on the base of what the most even the poor pilgrims thought of, right? Because everybody knew that Jerusalem was the big apple, right? That it all revolved around. I mean, I don't think even the knights had many doubts in this sense, but they were more concrete people. They knew what war was about, and they wanted to have kind of an assurance that this would go well. So Jerusalem was far, because they had basically to cross Anatolia, depending on the route, because the coastal areas were still technically Byzantine, but the frontier was pretty messed up there. There were many passes. These groups would take different routes. As I was saying before, some branches were actually slaughtered by the Turks along the way. Then they had to reach the Holy Land, the Near East actually, and they would have to storm cities, big ones. Like Anatolia didn't have much of great cities now. Actually didn't have any. But when you arrive to Antioch, or in fact even say Jerusalem, that starts to be serious. There were massive fortifications also from Roman Byzantine times that were stuff that, I mean, in Central Europe these guys had never seen either. Maybe something, Roman cities, like, I don't know, think about Trier or other, but these were kind of newer and still fitting and functional, right? So it is interesting to observe also this kind of in part technical potential, the differential, let's say, that existed between the two, and it's obvious that there was a great tension relatively to the meaning of this expedition at the same time. Like the whole thing was apocalyptic in nature. Like they thought that the reconquest of Jerusalem, of the Holy Land, would be some sort of precondition for the triggering factor for the arrival of Christ and the end of the world, around the end of times and Judgment's Day. So it was a real deal here, and you have to think, even at a strategical level, probably people were pretty upset about this. That was a fear about what this was, but it was a holy mission in this sense. So it appeared as literally the greatest and most just and perfect thing you could ever done. Like if there was a way to go, that was surely the right one in terms of outcome in terms of afterlife and in afterlife destination, let's say. So this made sense. This perspective makes sense, especially considering what the Pope had promised. That was salvation, right? And this is probably what appeared to be kind of one of the most consistent reasons, also for saying, the Pope said this. So the authority is so high that you don't even wonder, like you don't even question it. You just go, and this is what pushed them also in large parts. So what is interesting, we skipped the Council of Clermont because that's kind of, everybody kind of knows the story of it. But what is interesting is seemingly that some of these groups, of the initial groups, actually had in fact predated the council. So it would be even interesting to see how like the papacy was reacting to pre-existing pressure and demands for this, because it's likely that someone actually asked it. It's not the Pope one day woke up as well, saying, okay, let's call it Crusade, and everybody said, I didn't think about that. Oh, let's go to Jerusalem. Probably many people had demanded that from a long time to Jerusalem. Everybody knew that the Seljuks had arrived up there, and it was a big deal, and that there had been violence, and that the pilgrimage had become more risky, and this was a threat, and whatever. So it's there was objectively probably a common opinion revolving around these matters as well, that had contributed in part even to trigger the same crusade, not from the papal side, that however remained possibly in relative terms the most important aspect, right? It's probably, if the Pope had not called the crusade, probably there would have not been one, like at least not in the, maybe there would have been military expeditions later on, but not necessarily in this period, like with the same modalities, with the same ideological push and justification, right? Because it's obvious that the defeat of the Christians at the hands of the Seljuks at Manzikert had been a resounding event. I mean, the loss of Anatolia, I don't think that the West was particularly connected to Anatolia as such, but it's obvious that the Seljuk conquests all around had started, and the arrival even in the Holy Land had definitely been seen as part of this major collapse of the Byzantines in their eastern frontiers, right, against an enemy who was most evenly adverse to Christianity. So this had happened 20 years before, and so it was kind of fresh memory. So from Constantinople, the Crusaders finally move, and they gather together into different nuclei, etc. The barons together with the pilgrims, and they cross Anatolia, right? And at this point, what they beat repeatedly the Turkish troops that were sent against them by the potentates that at this point had definitely underestimated the danger this new arrived, right? And this is important because there is evidence by comprehensive study on Islamic history during the Crusades, that actually the Muslims didn't quite, like, they acknowledged the threat, the problem, etc., but they didn't see the arrival of the Westerners like as a big deal in itself. I mean, they didn't probably they gave it the importance that it objectively had, but it wasn't like a mind-blowing or worldview change that probably the West thought of himself with the Crusades, right? They might seem strange, but the Muslims kind of kept thinking mostly about themselves in their divisions, etc. And naturally, as losers in this first crusade, they didn't also need to celebrate it more than much. The real mind-blowing, like, traumatic event for the Muslims would be the Mongol invasions. Like, those they wiped out Baghdad, right? And that was really a real thing. It's as if someone had come to Rome and had wiped it out, right? And that would have been enormously. It's the same thing, the same level of trauma, right? If it had happened in the Western Christendom, and the Anatolian battles are very interesting because especially the Battle of Dorylaeum, is a proof actually of the superiority of Western warfare on the current local Near Eastern one. And up to a few years ago, I would have refuted this statement in the sense that, of course, what is the superiority in a context that can change in every moment? Okay, it's not an absolute superiority, but objectively there is a defeatism in the West. I don't know when it started with, I don't know, maybe with the Vietnam War or with Iraq, etc., Afghanistan. For the idea that, I don't know, we can't win against, Westerners can't win against guerrilla or kind of this non-conventional tactics, right? That are, of course, that doesn't mean anything by itself. These are stupid terms that, I don't know, just like geopolitics, all this, but they do not mean actual anything of symmetric warfare. There is nothing like symmetric warfare by definition. That's why, in fact, we can't talk properly of superiority of Frankish warfare over the Islamic one. But objectively, these heavily armored knights and their represented in their cavalry tactics represented a great problem to Muslim warfare, because they essentially couldn't cope with them adequately. After all, the Crusades showed that from a strictly tactical point of view, Western warfare was capable of coping with Eastern tactics. Like, the fact that you lose a war doesn't mean that on the field you don't actually win, right? Think about, I don't know, the French in Algeria. Everybody said, the French lost Algeria, it was a loss, a defeat. Yeah, okay, but on the field they were factually winning against guerrilla, right? So here it's basically the same thing. The Turks even had to adapt, to enhance their bows, to have a greater power. They had to I made a video about the let's say this myth that maybe not as famous, but it was spread actually by the same Westerners, because this is a problem that we have as Westerners, that we have to downsize what we were at the time. Like saying, I don't know, in the East there were so much better horsemen. Our horsemen were kind of less wieldy and whatever. This is not true, actually. First of all, what the Westerners had to get kind of from the East in terms of horse archery, etc., was immediately compensated. Just look at the videos we made about the Turcopoles, but also see what the core of Western warfare really was about. Now, who thinks that this means that the Westerners always won. No, it doesn't work like that. There is no army that always wins by definition, right? This is not the point. But the myth that somehow the Western heavy cavalry couldn't beat horse archers because we're too speedy, it's garbage. It's literally garbage. They did it. Like, they were able even to run after them. And there's plenty of that. I should make a more dedicated video actually. If you look at that on the myth of the poor Western mounts, that's the title. If you want to check that out, there are some examples of that, both for the Near East and the Iberian Peninsula during the Reconquista. But I think it's important because literally they shot these guys, and in the padded armor on their mail kind of stopped most of the arrows, and it you could see this Western knights going around with like tens of arrows stuck into them, but still alive. And at one point it wasn't a way, if they suffered tremendous losses at some point, but they still remained cohesive enough, and they didn't die in such large numbers to lose the cohesion that couldn't enable the Turks to charge, right? So obviously there are other problems in this context, because you should have valued the single battles, the single armies that confronted each other. Of course, the asymmetry was actually pretty low overall. Like, it's not that the Westerners had this tremendous advantage, but still found themselves in many occasions kind of well capable of dealing with the situation. Then, if you make idiotic choices for other reasons, because the command is split, because you don't know about, you hadn't made reconnaissance, etc., that's another point. We made if you go into the Crusader playlist video, you can find plenty of battles that we made about that Crusader defeats, for example, but these are all explained, and there is nothing like a default army that you can say this is always better, this is always worse. It doesn't work like that either. And so the Crusaders kept going on. In summer 1098, the Franks, as the Byzantines called them, or the Frankoi in Greek actually, and the Muslims, the Phalangi, I believe that was the name of the Franks, managed to seize Antioch. And also they made a massacre. By the way, I skipped one part, that is Nicaea. Nicaea was recaptured. It is a very important center. It's one of the Council of Constantine 325 on the Marmara Sea, and that was just in front of Constantinople. And the first thing the Byzantines do is that, okay, let's use these guys to storm Nicaea, and they do it, just like the Venetians will do during Fourth Crusade with Hungarian Zara, for example, in Croatia. And they seize it because it's a city that is close, it's important, whatever, because the Turks had seized most of basically the Anatolian hinterland was, after Manzikert was fallen to the Byzantines maintained mostly coastal cities, but that's how close the Turks had arrived in case of Nicaea. And when the problem is, now we don't have time to tell all the details, but basically the Byzantines had kind of planned with the Franks that theoretically everything they would reconquer would go back to the Byzantines, right? Including the next big city that was Antioch, that was really a thing. Was nothing in comparison to, Nicaea was nothing in comparison to it. The major capital of Syria, and that had been lost by the Byzantines actually a few times before, telling the truth, because before Manzikert, actually the Byzantines had campaigned in there. They were managing to retake in part even the same Jerusalem. So Antioch had a strong Byzantine continuity, and when the Byzantines saw that the Crusaders were not willing to give Antioch back, and also they were quarreling of who would take it, fundamentally, they started taking away support to them, and actually they started to fight. If you read the Gesta Tancredi, for example, by the French author, I don't remember the name, but there is about this, that the Greeks, the so-called Greeks, because that was the insulting name the Westerners used to tell that the Byzantines were not Romans but Greeks, technically, in their view, and the Byzantines answered that the ones of the West were technically just emperor of the Germans, not Roman emperors, whatever. But that's the kind of spirit that existed between the two. Actually, they started fighting. They started harassing each other. The Byzantines obviously did not want to get rid of the Turks by creating actually a greater power, like the Ottoman states would be. Because telling the truth, the Byzantines, in part, especially during the 12th century, they would start to reconquer slowly all of Anatolia. Technically speaking, by the time of Myriokephalon, like, they lost again, but at that point they were about to, apparently, by the way, because nobody actually knows how the Battle of Myriokephalon actually ended. If you study the sources, it's not like Manzikert that we know, that it might not have been this enormously catastrophic defeat as it's portrayed, but still was a sound defeat. About Myriokephalon, we don't know, but they had been able to surround the Anatolian heartland by conquering the coasts, and the next step was reconquer. So it was not such a dramatic situation like we often stress. Manzikert. After Manzikert, the Byzantine Empire was doomed to fall. No, it wasn't. It wasn't. The Byzantines, on many occasions, actually showed that they had the capability of reconquering it. And the main problem, if anything, were actually the Westerners. Like, at this point, the main problem of the Byzantines are not the Seljuk Turks, are the Siculo-Normans. That's another deal, right? And not just them, by the way. Just for saying that at Antioch, things start getting wrong between the Byzantines and the Franks, and the Franks are left on their own. And there is the famous Battle of Antioch in front of the city walls, and because the Crusaders tried to storm the city, but they were met outside the city wall by other forces, and they won. And there's all the legend of the True Cross, and there are many events that show and they massacred the population. In Antioch, there is a spoiler what would happen to Jerusalem, in the sense that the Crusaders start butchering everyone, including the Christians, the Eastern Christians. That if you think at it in perspective, like, it's not that the Byzantines had this kind of looked much different from the rest of these Eastern Christians that inhabited these lands were largely favorable to, if not the Byzantine government as such, because they obviously preferred always for a kind of a decentralized situation, but obviously they surely didn't like much the Franks either. Like, they were even of Latin, right, and they were kind of different in general. They were different peoples, so the Crusaders didn't actually think about it very much. They massacred them as well. And we will talk more about this thing of butchering the population of cities that were asked to surrender but that wouldn't. That is kind of a controversial topic, but we also have to contextualize it a bit. Not to saying that it was a positive thing, and that's important as well. And Antioch is this first massive achievement, right? Because it was objectively one of the largest metropolises of the Near East. And the Near Eastern Islamic world didn't expect this attack, that it seemed objectively crazy. Like, and we will see now why. But at the same time, the Islamic world itself was divided. Between Turks and Arabs, Sunni and Shia. So not much has changed after all. And the myth that Islam arrived and unified everything there is pure myth. Like, Islam, if anything, everywhere it went caused, especially in the Near East, actually caused political fragmentation. Like, the Near East especially always suffered this, but it's not an intrinsic problem with Islam, and this is, I don't want to be misunderstood. It's rather the fact that the modalities in which this happened led to the end of this, to this fragmentation, of the end of the caliphal unity, and so on. And and indeed, however, also Islamic political culture is a bit suspicious of centralized authority, of secular authority, let's say better, and whatever. But that's another story. We made other videos on that topic. If you go in the medieval Islam playlist, you can't find that. And to observe the reasons why that can explain the success of the Franks in this context, well, surprise was one. Like, for example, the Crusaders were ignorant of geography and of the climate of the Near East. Like, just if you think about it, they crossed the desertic, the Anatolian desertic plateau in full summer. Like, I've never been there personally. I never visited Turkey, but that I can tell you it's not really a good thing, probably to do especially if you hate hot weather like I do. And to me, summer is a dry. If I don't have an air conditioner, and you can imagine what it means to cross it with padded armor, with iron mail, and fighting. Right, and you have to wear it. You have to wear your armor, because it doesn't matter how there are Turks that wherever you crossed will make rain on you, hails of arrows, and that's pretty advisable, right? And the Turks played exactly with this tactics, like harassing. This was the nightmare of the Crusades: being harassed, being their supply chains, and the fact that these swarms of light horse archers would come and go, and you would never know where the attack would come, because objectively that was the Turkish tactics, like exhausting the enemy so that the heavy cavalry could eventually intervene to finish them off. And that's how the Battle of Manzikert, for example, about which I made a 3-hour video, you can search for, was fought, right? And there were intrinsic limits to this, though, because usually Turks had heavy cavalry, and also a pretty good one, but also a relatively few. So sometimes they couldn't even, probably, like it happened in Manzikert, they couldn't finish off much. They could make enemies retreat, but still not disintegrating them completely with a massive shock charge, at least in certain cases, especially if the enemies were militarily competent. Another, let's say, consider that Crusaders were quarrelsome. They didn't like each other. They always argued. They got offended. Were extremely proud. It was seen before, the typical arrogant mentality of the Western Knight, right? That is a hassle, to be honest, and extremely violent people that kind of think they are the best than everyone, and they have constantly to prove it. This is detrimental to the whole expedition in part. But at the same time, these are solidly competent military commanders at the same time, so there is this due to them that we often picture them just as a undisciplined rabble of strange people. But they were probably, in my opinion, the more I read about this campaign, the more I realize how competent, militarily speaking, this expedition was. Right, and it doesn't surprise me more than much, objectively, that it was successful at the same time. So the surprise factor was an element, as we were saying. For example, the emirates of Anatolia and of Syria were similarly hostile among each other. Right, they hated each other's guts. Right, the Islam was as fragmented, if not even more fragmented, than Christianity at the time. It's kind of ridiculous when you hear those perspectives, like as if the Christians among themselves were so always friends, and the Muslims were always friends, and just tried to kill each other because they were either they were of different religion. I mean, these guys fought their entire lives against every single neighbor they had. Like, this was the standard, independently from religion, right? And and this Anatolian and Syrian Muslims thought that these crusaders would never deal with the tough summer and winter excesses, like of one of the toughest continental climates, like those areas are, and paradoxically, probably the tactical and strategical confusion of the Crusaders was a factor of success, because the Crusaders didn't actually know properly what they had to do. They decided it step by step. So the Muslims froze a little bit because they didn't know where to invest their efforts and concentrate them to wipe the Crusaders out. The Crusaders, as we've seen, were able and courageous warriors. They were indisciplined. They didn't have a common plan. They were incapable in part of coordinating synergically all their forces, especially from a strategical point of view. So tactically speaking, they were better, but even in there, everything was pretty messy. Like we have just said that they were competent, but still there are certain problems that occur that you can't escape, especially if you have to deal with people that you don't trust, that you always want to prevaricate. So in time of need, of course, they would display a terrific ability and courage at the limit of fanatism, in fact. And this is also another character, like probably fanatism and religious but the feudal mindset was fanatic by itself. Like the concept of the shock charge, this fact you had to throw yourself into the melee no matter what, was nearly suicidal. Like these guys didn't care. So the Turks fought in a slightly different way, and also they found this somewhat surprising, right? Also because, as we will see now, they were used to the periodical Byzantine counteroffensives and to the presence in such contexts, even if never in a kind of such a massive way, numerically speaking of Western mercenaries. I mean, they knew what they were about. In fact, they kind of estimated them. The Turks, especially coming from the steppes, having this kind of proto-feudal culture, and especially being heavily Persified in Iran, where the core base of Seljuk power was, and therefore Persian culture being most eminently feudal and chivalric. They looked at these Westerners and they thought they were kind of cool. Like they liked their taste for horsemanship and their ability, their pride, their courage. So they actually estimated each other pretty much. I mean, these they wanted to tear each other apart, and they did it as soon as they could. But they also displayed great respect for military honor, like as such. It was recognized, at least in officially, right? And so the Muslims couldn't, however, realize that they were facing a substantially new fact, an armed pilgrimage directed to Jerusalem, heading to Jerusalem. This was really new. Like, they knew the Byzantines would try that, but they knew the Byzantines. They had always been on their frontiers. They knew what their tactics were. They knew they were tough as hell. Like, the imperial army was a kind of a freaking death machine, but it still was a known enemy, right? The Franks were also known, but nobody would expect they would come in this mass, right? What is interesting about this is that about the first crusade and the others, but especially the first one, is that these two worlds didn't know each other very much. I mean, you can argue that the Byzantines were a bit like the joint in this context, in that, as we've said before, of course, there was some realization in the West what the Near East was and vice versa, because people traded and talked and exchanged, and it wasn't just war. War was just a minor aspect overall of all the contacts that existed between East and West. But it was completely new to see this consistent number of, like, we're talking about in the range of thousands of Frankish knights coming literally out of the blue, right? Consider that Muslims had, they mostly knew about the Mediterranean peoples. They knew about Spain, they knew about the Italians, they knew about the Byzantines, of course. Well, when you take, like, the Frankish West, like, they knew it existed, but it's not that they had been dramatically acquainted to this enormous masses of enemy. They considered it them, like, geographically, like a kind of a big deal. Like the Seljuks especially were in a completely, they were more oriented towards, like, they had arrived in the Near East themselves relatively recently. Like, the Seljuks had started as a Middle Eastern power, and even in, the Battle of Manzikert kind of opened the gates of Anatolia and of the Eastern Mediterranean coast to these bands of Turks that came from a bit everywhere, but like that was still a frontier for themselves, right? So these guys were coming from across, beyond the Byzantine Empire, way across the frontier, in lands that up to that point had never politically kind of showed up, right? That's the most interesting thing. The Muslim world had their own, I don't know, the Normans in Sicily, the Franks in Spain. I mean, the Franks meaning, of course, the Spanish powers, but backed by also by these Frankish mercenaries, and especially northern Iberian culture being heavily Francicized in this time. But their mind had been mostly polarized towards the Byzantines, that were seen as the westernmost area of interaction in that specific context. So this was objectively something new and amazing that you don't find elsewhere, right? You find other things historically that are somewhat very different. Even the same Islamic invasions are largely fueled by local peoples rather than Arabs proper. Like, the Arabs were just chiefs. Here you find an army that is objectively modest, but is able to take this enormous chunk of the Near East in one shot, and nobody basically did much about it to counter it, to stop it. And I think I would conclude this video talking about the take of Jerusalem between the spring and the beginning of summer of 1099. This is a major event that crowns the First Crusade and makes it achieved. Like, the First Crusade is the only one that actually succeeded. The others were all a failure in one way or another. I mean, at least the larger ones. So think about this horde of armed warriors and of originally almost harmless pilgrims that are toughened by the long journey. They've become evil. They've become really, they're deprived and caught by this enthusiasm that immediately, because the Crusaders are right in front of Jerusalem, like, without any logistical capability, they're exhausted. So they had just one option to survive, at least, unless they wanted to come back. And some Crusaders had stopped along the road, right? They had conquered other centers along the way, from Antioch, and eventually expanded into the Syrian hinterland, and along the Lebanese coast, all the cities fell, right? So they had left other people behind, or people had died of starvation, of epidemics, of war as such. We've seen it. There are the same Christian chronicles that actually state that they were running out of food, that the local peasantry wouldn't help them. So they basically butchered these people, and they cooked them and they ate them. This is, I think, in the Gesta Tancredi telling you truth. So mostly, perfectly Christian historiography. I mean, maybe it's an exaggeration, but we don't have to think it was excessively far from the truth, given the dramatic situation in which these guys found themselves in. And so the only way to take Jerusalem was by storm. They didn't have enough wood for building the siege towers, stuff like that. The peasant sailors basically destroyed their own ships, and they built with the relics this siege towers, allegedly. And because there were other groups, there were other individuals who had joined, other French, Lombards, Germans, that progressively had, what I would like to stress is how many people, how many groups, more than many people, because it's not there were an enormous much, the numbers sometimes are large, but overall there were a few, and they decreased along the way, of course. So they take Jerusalem by storm, and actually, Jerusalem was taken on July the 15th. I mean, they arrived, I think, there at the end of spring and beginning of summer, and the Franks swarmed into the city, massacring basically almost all of the Muslim and Jewish inhabitants. And even if before the beginning of the siege, the Saracen governor hadn't expelled the Eastern Christians from the city, the Crusaders basically massacred them. They didn't have capacity to recognize them, right? And this is interesting because the fact that they weren't expelled before actually suggests either that they were, however, forced, that we don't know whether they liked, what they liked best, whether the Saracens or the Franks. But let's say that they were still inhabitants of Jerusalem, and then of course they cared about their own city, so they weren't seen as a threat by the same Saracen governor, and probably they resisted as well. That's also part of the reason why probably were. And the Crusaders butchered them. This is heavy stuff. If you think about it, it's dark. Many people say, well, you shouldn't be really. These things were normal at the time. It was just brutal violence everywhere. Well, in my opinion, this is not correct. I mean, historically speaking, of course, the 11th century is pretty archaic as a time, let's say. But there was a lot of this made a lot of sensation. It wasn't normal to take cities and to exterminate its population. It happened. Of course, you have to think about how angry and hungry in part these Crusaders were, and how they saw this we made it. They were kind of berserker at this point in mindset. They were completely into we've made it. We are one step from heaven, right? This doesn't justify that, but let's say that it is true that cities that were asked to surrender and would be treated harshly, even up to extermination. But it is not entirely true that it was the standard at the time. This was a very bad thing, all the story that the blood of the killed people arrived to the knees of the horses. It's very graphic. It's possibly true, actually. Well, okay, maybe not, but just for saying how this I mean, the Christian sources could simply say, okay, no, we arrived there, we treated everybody fairly. No, the same Christian sources, and this is the greatness of medieval civilization, that they actually were not hypocritical. They said things as they were. Like the Christian sources stated, yeah, we conquered Jerusalem, we massacred people who were there. Like, but it wasn't a positive thing. It wasn't said, yeah, we did it, we killed this bastard. No, it was seen as a tragedy in this immense thing that had been accomplished, the reconquest of the holiest city. And it's it's difficult even to address these topics without wondering, like, I'm much for rational explanations, though. I believe that, in fact, yes, you can rationalize this, like saying it was normal, but at the same time you have to think of the peculiar context, about all the sufferings, all the tension, the anger, the hatred, and probably the fact that these were different people from the ones they had seen elsewhere. There was the myth that that racism is a modern invention is actually false. I mean, racism is actually a modern invention, but this idea of discrimination towards the different, it was very alive out there, not just from a religious point of view, as some would like to say. I mean, different human groups generally tend to hate each other. And objectively, think about the same Christians that lived in Jerusalem. I mean, they were living there. Like, it was a Muslim government, they were still there. Not much had happened to them. These guys arrive and besiege the city. What do? Like, you're surely not happy that the Franks are coming to storm your city, because you know what they want. You know that they have slaughtered the inhabitants at Antioch. You know that they're what they are. So this was probably they would have escaped if they could. These are all suppositions, let's say, but let's remember that there are logics that go beyond the Christian versus Muslim dichotomy, as simple as it is. These were different communities, different peoples that didn't quite like each other. For many reasons. Yes, including religion, but not all. Right? However, the city of Jerusalem was repopulated with Eastern Christians, and also their co-religionaries, such as the Syrians and the Armenians. Right? And after a while, even the Muslims and the Jews were allowed to resettle in Jerusalem, right? So also another proof that this is not what you could define a war of religion, because if that had been the deal, like, Muslims and Jews would have never been re-allowed into the city, right? It was not a matter of converting these people, right? There were forced conversions at some points, sure, but still, people from all religions lived in these places and under Crusader rule, as much as it had been under Islamic rule. Because these assets are precious. Like, it's not that people really give a damn which religion you are. This is why we can't talk about tolerance in modern sense of the word. But during the medieval times, you can talk about tolerance as a sort of coexistence, more or less successful coexistence of groups for essentially political reasons, right? The more groups you have, and the more you have potential allies that you can play on to equilibrate society, and you have people who trade and who work. So it's important in the 11th century, even the sheer demographic element. You have someone who works the land, who makes the traffics going on. So these are evidently very important trade routes, right? Now we don't have time to explain further, because let's stop it here. Maybe on another occasion we will talk specifically about the conquest, the partition, the kingdom of Jerusalem, its decline, the fall of Acre, all these events that are major, important episodes of Crusader history. But for now, I just wanted to tell you about this, and to just broaden a little bit the picture from what is commonly told about the stories, or maybe just the attitude towards it, because these are well-known facts, right? It doesn't take me to tell it for you, as we were saying at the beginning of the video. And I just think it's kind of useful to talk about it again, and not to stress too much interpretations that can be misleading, can be like, you should never be radical in interpretations. Like, history teaches you not to be radical, not to be dogmatic, not to be it teaches you how to be flexible, which doesn't mean to be flexible morally speaking. On the contrary, it means you're able to recognize actual value of things in the different contexts that history provides you with. And that's the only way you can do it. Alright, so for today, I just think that it's everything, and I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.